At 4:23 a.m. on June 17, 1969, Sergeant Nguyen Van Thanh crouched in thick undergrowth 3 kilometers west of Firebase Ripcord, watching an Allied reconnaissance patrol move through the jungle toward his position. 6 Americans, heavily armed, cautious, scanning the tree line every few meters. He had no mines, no artillery support, no reinforcements within 10 kilometers, just a pit he'd dug 2 days ago filled with 7 bamboo pit vipers and a tripwire system every officer in the People's Army of Vietnam had explicitly forbidden him from using. In the next 4 minutes, that improvised trap would shatter standard doctrine and save an entire NVA supply corridor from discovery. The official PAVN field manual designated 18 approved methods for slowing enemy reconnaissance. Than's wasn't one of them. Company command had threatened him with reassignment twice for unauthorized modifications endangering comrades. But regulations don't mean much when you've watched 14 men die in 5 weeks because the approved methods require equipment nobody has. Thanh adjusted the tripwire, checking the tension one last time. The central Highlands air was thick with moisture, every breath heavy with the smell of rotting vegetation and red clay. He could hear the Americans now, speaking in low voices, the distinctive metallic click of safeties being thumbed off. The patrol leader was signaling with hand gestures, spreading his team into a dispersed formation, professional, careful, exactly the kind of unit that had been bleeding NVA positions dry for months. The wire trembled slightly. One chance. He waited. Nguyen Van Thanh grew up in Thanh Hoa province, where his father worked the rice paddies, 12-hour days under the sun, a harvest that barely fed 5 children and left nothing for savings. Thanh was the eldest, the one who spent mornings helping in the fields and afternoons at the village school, learning to read and write when most of his friends stayed home to work. At 16, he was teaching younger children, helping them navigate the complexities of Vietnamese grammar and the occasional French word left over from colonial times. The work taught him to observe patterns, to see how small details connected to larger systems. A failing rice chute could signal drainage problems affecting an entire paddy. A sick water buffalo could mean parasites in the water that would spread to others. You learned to spot problems before they became disasters, and you learned to solve them with whatever materials were available because the village cooperative sure as hell wasn't providing new equipment. He volunteered for the People's Army in February 1966, 4 months after his 19th birthday. The recruiter promised training, purpose, and a chance to defend the homeland. Thanh got 8 weeks of basic instruction, an AK-47 that jammed in humidity, and a truck south to Military Region 5. By the time he reached the Central Highlands in April 1966, he'd seen enough of the war to know the recruiter had told the truth about only one thing. This was about defending the homeland. Everything else was harder than anyone had described. The 559th Transportation Group pushed supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail like blood through veins. Every weapon, every bag of rice, every medical kit that reached the southern battlefields traveled through that network. But what killed more NVA soldiers than American bombs was Allied reconnaissance, long-range patrols that mapped supply routes at dawn and dusk, calling in airstrikes on any concentration of personnel they found. The American LRRPs were the most dangerous, 4 to 6-man teams that moved through the jungle like ghosts, indigenous trackers who knew the terrain as well as the NVA did, radio operators who could summon helicopter gunships in minutes, silent, lethal, effective. They'd appear out of nowhere, photograph a supply cache, and vanish before anyone could respond. American doctrine said to conduct reconnaissance patrols with minimal contact, gather intelligence, and extract. The problem was they were exceptionally good at it. The NVA had standard countermeasures, observation posts, patrol patterns, early warning systems using signal mirrors and runners, anti-aircraft positions to discourage helicopter insertion. All of it required resources, coordination, and time. The 304th Division had 12 anti-aircraft guns for 200 kilometers of trail. Observation posts were undermanned. Patrol patterns were predictable because units were stretched too thin to vary them. So, LRRP teams kept coming, and supply caches kept burning. Private First Class Tron von Lok died on April 23, 1969. An American patrol spotted him at a trail junction 2 kilometers south of Firebase Bastogne. Lok was carrying rice to a forward position, alone because his partner had dysentery. The reconnaissance team photographed the location and extracted. Fighter bombers arrived 6 hours later. Lok took shrapnel from a 500-pound bomb. He was 22 years old, from Haiphong, a fisherman's son who'd enlisted with Thanh on the same day. Corporal Pham Minh Duc died on May 3rd. Another LRRP patrol, another trail compromise. Duc was part of a supply team moving ammunition at night. The Americans had infrared scopes. They watched from 300 meters, never fired a shot, just radioed coordinates. Artillery arrived at dawn. Duc was 23, from Huo. He'd studied engineering before the war. He taught Thanh how to read topographic maps, how to estimate distances using terrain features, how to move through jungle without leaving obvious traces. The American artillery strike left nothing to bury. Sergeant Le Van Khai died on May 19th. Same pattern. The LRRP teams were getting bolder, moving closer to supply depots. This one infiltrated within 100 meters of a battalion assembly area. Khai was checking defensive positions when the airstrikes came. He was from Vinh. Always shared his tobacco, even when he had 3 cigarettes left. An F-4 Phantom's napalm caught him in the open. The medic tried. The burns were too severe. By early June 1969, the 304th Division had lost 68 men to reconnaissance-directed attacks in 2 months. Not battles, not frontal assaults, just reconnaissance patrols doing their job, while the NVA had no effective answer. Thanh watched each one. He knew Lok and Duc personally. Khai had been in his platoon. Each death felt preventable. Each death made him angrier. The official response from Division Command was predictable. Maintain discipline. Improve camouflage procedures. Enhance security protocols. Captain Vo held a meeting after Khai died. 30 exhausted soldiers in a tunnel complex that smelled like mildew and spent gunpowder. Higher command is aware of the reconnaissance problem, Vo said. His uniform was cleaner than theirs. He'd arrived from division headquarters that morning. Additional anti-aircraft resources are expected within the month. Until then, maintain vigilance and follow established protocols. Thanh stood in the back. He'd been thinking about the problem for weeks. The Thanh Hoa rice paddies had taught him that when you can't get new equipment, you improvise with what you have. The LRRP patrols always used the same infiltration routes. They moved carefully but predictably, and they had one vulnerability nobody was exploiting: their fear. "Sir," Thanh said, "what if we rigged traps that didn't kill, but incapacitated? Something that would make them extract immediately, stop the reconnaissance before it completes." Vo looked at him like he'd suggested using firecrackers. "Comrade Sergeant, the field manual is very clear on authorized obstacle systems. Booby traps are defensive measures requiring specific positioning and integration with fire support. They're not psychological weapons. But, sir, if we could disrupt their patrols before they gather intelligence? The answer is no. We're not setting random traps that could injure our own personnel or violate protocols on proper warfare. Dismissed. Thanh said nothing, but he didn't forget. The patrols kept coming. More men kept dying. The approved methods required resources they didn't have. The unauthorized method required jungle materials, knowledge of snake behavior, and a willingness to risk punishment. On the night of June 14, 1969, Thanh made his decision. Another LRRP team had directed strikes that afternoon, killing 3 soldiers from 2nd Company, Privates Nguyen and Hoang, Corporal Bin, all dead because a reconnaissance team slipped through at 0900 hours and nobody could stop them. Thanh waited until midnight. His unit was positioned along a supply corridor 12 kilometers west of Firebase Ripcord, 3 kilometers north of a known LRRP infiltration route. American positions were visible on the ridgeline to the east. The reconnaissance teams used a network of game trails that offered good concealment and easy navigation. Predictable route, heavy vegetation, perfect for reconnaissance. He took a machete, a coil of tripwire scavenged from an unexploded American bomb, 2 stakes carved from bamboo, and a canvas bag. No permission, no backup, no witnesses. He moved into the jungle alone. The June night was stifling. Humidity made every breath feel like drowning. He could hear artillery to the south, constant and rhythmic like a heartbeat that never stopped. The infiltration route was empty, but that didn't mean safe. American sensors were sometimes hidden along trails, motion detectors that could call in artillery if tripped. He found a spot where the trail narrowed between 2 banyan trees. Good fields of observation from the NVA side, limited visibility from the American side until you were almost on top of it. He began digging. The pit didn't need to be deep, just deep enough. 18 inches, 2 feet across. He dug with the machete and his hands, moving the excavated dirt away from the immediate area, spreading it in the undergrowth so it wouldn't show fresh disturbance. The jungle floor was soft, years of decomposition making the work easier than expected. Then came the dangerous part. He'd marked snake locations over the previous 3 days. Bamboo pit vipers were common in the central Highlands, aggressive, highly venomous. The Americans called them 2-step snakes because of a myth that you'd die within 2 steps of being bitten. The reality was longer, but not by much. Untreated bites caused massive tissue necrosis, swelling, and respiratory failure within 30 minutes. Thanh approached the first snake location carefully, a hollow log 20 meters from the trail. He used a forked stick to pin the snake's head, grabbed it behind the skull, and dropped it into the canvas bag. The viper writhed, angry, striking at the bag's interior. He found 6 more over the next hour. Each one was a calculated risk. Get bitten, and he'd be dead before reaching help. But the snakes were the weapon. They were what would make the trap work. Back at the pit, he lined the bottom with a layer of leaves to keep the snakes contained, but not visible. Then he carefully emptied the canvas bag. 7 bamboo pit vipers coiled at the bottom of the pit, confused, agitated, searching for escape. Thanh covered the pit with a lattice of thin bamboo strips and leaves, carefully camouflaged to look like undisturbed jungle floor. From 3 feet away, it was invisible. The tripwire was next. He drove 1 stake into the ground on the left side of the trail, angling it toward the American approach vector. The stake went 12 inches deep. He used a rock to hammer it stable. The second stake went in on the right side, 16 feet across. He measured by pacing. Then came the wire. He wrapped it around the first stake 3 times, tight as he could make it. The wire was thin, barely visible in daylight, completely invisible at night or in shadow. Stretched the wire across the trail at exactly 4 inches off the ground. Not ankle height, not shin height, but the exact height where a man stepping carefully wouldn't see it until his boot was already moving forward. He wrapped the other end around the second stake, 3 loops again. Then he tested the wire by placing pressure on it. The covering over the pit was designed to collapse under weight. The snakes would be released directly onto whoever fell through. Too much tension on the wire, and it would be visible. Too little, and it wouldn't trip properly. He adjusted, tested again. The wire was barely taut, a whisper of resistance that would catch a boot without being felt until too late. The whole setup took 3 hours. He sat in the undergrowth afterward, catching his breath, watching the trail. If a patrol came now, he'd have to warn them somehow. If an officer found out, court-martial. If it worked, maybe fewer supply caches would burn. That was the calculation. Simple math from the rice paddies. Risk versus reward. He scattered more leaves over the area, making the trail look completely natural. The stakes were already moss-covered and dirty, looked like they'd been there for months. Someone would have to be looking directly at them, at the right angle, in good light to notice. By the time they did, they'd be on top of the trap. Thanh crawled back to NVA lines at 3:30 a.m. He didn't tell anyone. He couldn't. Vo had been clear. This was unauthorized. This violated doctrine. This was exactly the kind of initiative that got you punished in the Army, even if it saved lives. He sat in his fighting position and waited for dawn. The trap was out there, hidden and lethal, waiting. The reconnaissance patrol appeared at 4:19 a.m. on June 17, 1969. Thanh was on watch, eating cold rice from a bamboo container. The morning mist was thick enough to cut, visibility reduced to 30 meters in any direction. Then he heard them, boot on soft earth, the whisper of equipment rubbing against web gear, careful movement through thick vegetation. An American LRRP team, 6 men, approaching from the northeast at deliberate speed. Routine patrol. They weren't expecting contact. Thanh could see the point man now through the mist, moving in a crouch, rifle up, eyes scanning. A Montagnard guide, probably Jarai or Sedang, someone who knew the jungle as well as the NVA did. Behind him, 5 Americans, infantry, experienced, the kind of team that had been dismantling supply operations for months, 50 meters from the wire. Than's heart hammered against his ribs. This either worked or it didn't. If it didn't, the patrol would find the pit, photograph it, report it, and doctrine violations would be the least of his problems. If it did, he'd violated direct orders, and there'd be consequences. He didn't care. Locke, Duke, and Kai had died 2 weeks ago. The list was too long, 40 meters. The patrol maintained interval, 5 meters between each man. Professional spacing. The point man was reading the terrain, checking for disturbed earth, unusual vegetation patterns, any sign of recent traffic, 20 meters. The team leader signaled a halt. Thanh held his breath. Had they spotted something? The Americans conferred in whispers, then continued forward. Just a routine pause to check their position, 10 meters from the wire. The point man was moving carefully, each step deliberate, testing the ground before committing weight. The Montagnard guide was good, very good, but the trap wasn't on the ground. It was the ground, 5 meters. Thanh could see individual details now. The point man's face was painted in green and brown camouflage. He carried an M16 suppressed, a radio on the second man's back. the patrol leader with binoculars hanging from his neck. The point man's boot came down 6 inches from the wire, shifted weight, stepped forward again. The toe of his right boot caught the tripwire at 4:23 a.m. The effect was immediate. The bamboo lattice collapsed. The point man's leg dropped through into the pit. His full weight came down. 7 bamboo pit vipers, agitated from 2 days of captivity, struck instantly. Multiple strikes, legs, ankle, lower calf. The point man screamed. Not the controlled yell of someone trained to manage pain, but a primal shriek of pure terror. He tried to pull his leg out. The pit's edges crumbled, dropping him further in. More strikes. The snakes were coiled around his leg now, biting repeatedly. The patrol exploded into chaos. 2 men rushed forward to help. The team leader yelled at them to stop, check for secondary traps. The point man was thrashing, trying to climb out, screaming about snakes. One of the Americans finally grabbed him, pulled him clear of the pit. His leg was a horror show, 8 visible bite marks, already swelling, blood mixed with venom leaking through torn fabric. The team leader was on the radio immediately. Medevac, emergency extraction, grid coordinates. The point man was going into shock, pupils dilated, breathing rapid and shallow. One of the Americans was trying to apply a tourniquet. Another was staring into the pit, his face gone pale. Than could see why. 7 vipers were clearly visible now, coiled at the bottom, ready to strike anything that came close. The patrol leader made the decision in 30 seconds. Abort the reconnaissance, extract immediately. They had a man down, potentially dying, and no way to continue the mission. He popped a smoke grenade, marking their position. The radio operator was calling in a helicopter. The team formed a defensive perimeter, but their focus was on the wounded man, not on surveillance. Than watched from concealment as the chaos unfolded. The medevac helicopter arrived 12 minutes later, a UH-1 Huey that hovered just long enough for the team to load their casualty and climb aboard. The entire patrol extracted. No reconnaissance gathered, no intelligence collected, no artillery called in. The mission was a complete failure. Than stayed in position for another hour, making sure no follow-up patrol arrived. Then he moved to the trap site. The pit was exposed now, snakes still visible at the bottom. He used a long stick to lever them out, one by one, returning them to the jungle. Then he filled in the pit, scattered leaves, and erased all evidence that anything had been there. He returned to the company position at 700 hours. Nobody questioned where he'd been. Guard rotation was normal. He sat down, ate more rice, and said nothing. Private Chow found him cleaning his rifle at 1400 hours. I heard the Americans extracted a patrol this morning. Emergency. Someone got hurt. Than didn't look up, probably hit a mine. Cow sat down. They were talking on their radio. Someone on our side heard it. They were screaming about snakes. Said something about a pit. Than kept cleaning. Bad luck. Jungle's full of snakes. Cow looked at him for a long moment. They'd been in basic training together. Cow was from Than Hoa, too, north side. They'd known each other since they were children. If someone set that up, he'd be in trouble. Than said nothing. Big trouble, Chow continued. But if it stopped the patrol from completing their mission, maybe it was worth it. Chow stood up. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything either. That night, after dark, Chow told 2 others, Privates Min and Dong. Both had lost friends to reconnaissance-directed attacks. Both understood what Than had done and why. Within 3 days, 6 soldiers knew the method. Than hadn't told them. Cow had told Min. Min told Dong. That soldier told another. word spread through the underground network that exists in every military unit, the whispered conversations that happen after officers sleep. Private Min rigged one on a different trail 8 kilometers north. Same setup, similar results. An LRRP team triggered it on June 23rd. 1 casualty, patrol aborted, no intelligence gathered. Corporal Dong set one up near an observation post. Sergeant Hai put one across a route the Americans used for night movements. None of them had permission. None of them documented it. They just did it. The 4th Patrol hit Hai's trap on June 28th. This one didn't extract immediately. The team leader was more experienced, possibly suspicious. They treated the casualty in place, continued the reconnaissance for another hour before extracting, but they moved slower, more cautiously. The intelligence they gathered was less comprehensive than normal. By early July, American reconnaissance in the 304th Division sector had changed noticeably. LRRP patrols were still coming, but they were moving differently, more cautious, scanning for ground-level traps before scanning for enemy positions, taking longer to cover the same distance, and, crucially, reporting snake hazards at a much higher rate than normal. Captain Thomas Reynolds of MAC-VSOG's Command and Control North noticed it first. Reynolds commanded reconnaissance operations in the Central Highlands, 12 teams covering 200 square kilometers. He'd been running missions in the area since October 1968. He knew the terrain, knew the NVA patterns, and he knew that in the past 3 weeks, 4 of his teams had encountered snake-related casualties under circumstances that didn't match natural patterns. On July 2nd, he examined after-action reports from all 4 incidents personally. Team 3-2, Point Man bitten by multiple vipers after stepping into a concealed pit. Team 1-4, Scout bitten after triggering a tripwire-activated trap. Team 2-1, Assistant Team Leader bitten in a similar pit trap. Team 4-3, Indigenous Guide bitten in another pit, this one containing at least 6 snakes. The pattern was unmistakable. These weren't random encounters. The pits were too similar, the snake concentrations too high, the locations too coincidental. Someone was building snake traps along reconnaissance routes. Someone who understood where the Americans would move and how to exploit their movements. Reynolds wrote a classified intelligence summary on July 5, 1969. Subject: NVA anti-reconnaissance tactics. The report was skeptical at first. Snake pits weren't sophisticated enough to stop trained reconnaissance teams. The psychological effect was significant, but physical damage was manageable with proper first aid. But Reynolds noted something crucial. The traps were achieving their goal. Reconnaissance missions that encountered them were either aborting completely or reducing their effectiveness significantly. The report circulated through MACV intelligence channels on July 12th. Initial response was dismissive. Snake traps were crude, ineffective, more hazard than weapon. Field interrogations of captured NVA soldiers found no documentation of the tactic. It wasn't in their training manuals. It wasn't in their standard operating procedures. But it was happening. By late July, LRRP teams operating around Firebase Ripcord and Firebase Bastogne had standing orders to scan for ground-level snake traps before proceeding. Point men moved at half speed. Indigenous scouts checked trail surfaces for recent digging. The cautious approach reduced reconnaissance effectiveness by 30%. Patrols that previously covered 15 kilometers in 6 hours were now covering 10 kilometers in 8 hours. Intelligence gathering declined proportionally. American casualties from reconnaissance operations dropped in the 304th Division sector, but so did intelligence collection. Artillery strikes called in by reconnaissance decreased from 43 in June to 17 in August. Supply interdiction effectiveness fell accordingly. NVA logistics along that section of the Ho Chi Minh Trail improved measurably. And still, officially, nobody in the People's Army knew about the snake traps. Captain Vo figured it out on July 15, 1969. He was inspecting defensive positions when he found Corporal Dong setting up a pit trap along a trail known to be used by American patrols. Same setup Than had pioneered: bamboo pit, captured vipers, tripwire at ankle height. Dong froze when he saw the captain. Vo walked over and examined the setup carefully. Measurements, angles, wire tension. He took out his notebook and sketched the configuration. "Where did you learn this?" Vo asked. His voice was neutral, neither angry nor approving. "Sergeant Than, sir." Vo was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked Dong to walk him through the installation process while he watched. Took notes, asked about success rates. How many American patrols had encountered these traps? How many had aborted their missions? What the casualty figures looked like. 4 traps, sir. 3 definite hits. 2 patrols aborted completely. 1 continued, but at reduced effectiveness. 0 friendly casualties. Total material cost: a pit, some wire, and snakes that are already in the jungle. Vo closed his notebook. "The field manual doesn't authorize this method." "No, sir. I explicitly ordered against improvised traps that could endanger personnel." "Yes, sir." Vo looked at the empty trail. "American reconnaissance in this sector has been less effective recently. I'd noticed, sir. Show me 2 more placement options for different terrain. I want to see how this adapts to various trail conditions." Dong blinked. "Sir." "That's an order, Corporal." By July 20th, Vo had documented 11 separate snake trap installations across the company's area of operations. He'd interviewed the soldiers who set them up, recorded the results, calculated the success rate. 86% of American patrols that triggered the traps either aborted their missions completely or had their effectiveness significantly reduced. 0 friendly casualties from the traps themselves. 1 minor snakebite to a NVA soldier who was careless during setup. He wrote a report. 3 pages. Technical specifications, tactical recommendations, statistical validation. He sent it up to battalion on July 22nd. The response came back on July 29th. Method unauthorized. Discontinue immediately. Violates protocols on proper warfare and fails to meet standards for approved obstacle systems. Vo read the response twice. Then he filed it and did nothing. The snake traps stayed up. The casualty rate stayed down. The reconnaissance effectiveness stayed reduced. And officially, nothing was happening. The statistics told a story battalion couldn't ignore forever. In May 1969, before the snake traps, the 304th Division lost 41 men to reconnaissance-directed attacks. In June, after the traps began appearing, they lost 19. In July, they lost 7. Reconnaissance patrol sightings in the division sector dropped from 134 in May to 68 in June to 39 in July. Artillery strikes called in by American reconnaissance teams fell proportionally. May had 112 separate artillery missions, directed at NVA positions. June had 53. July had 22. Someone in Division Intelligence noticed. Colonel Dang, the Division Intelligence officer, pulled the casualty reports and spotted the pattern. He sent investigators to the front lines in late July. They found the snake traps within 3 days. Dang's response was pragmatic. He couldn't officially approve a method that violated established doctrine, but he couldn't ignore results either. His compromise was to do nothing. No orders to stop, No orders to continue. Just a memo that went nowhere, and a blind eye turned toward the front. In August 1969, the 304th Division was rotated off the line for rest and repositioning. Than's company was moved to a rear area near the Laotian border. Real sleep, hot food, time to recover. On August 18th, Than was called to division headquarters. He reported in his cleanest uniform, which still looked like it had been through a war. Colonel Dang met him in a tent office. "Sergeant Than, I've read reports about your improvised reconnaissance countermeasures." "Sir," Dang raised a hand, "I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to ask you to train others." Than didn't expect that, Dang explained. The 320th Division was taking over the 304th Sector. They needed to know how to counter American reconnaissance. The official anti-reconnaissance training was 2 weeks long and required equipment the Army didn't have. Than's method took 2 days and used materials from the jungle. "I can't make it official," Dang said, "but I can assign you to a training detail. You teach the method to reconnaissance defense teams. We call it environmental hazard awareness in the paperwork. Nobody needs to know exactly what that means." Than spent 3 weeks in September 1969 teaching 42 soldiers how to set snake traps. Placement, construction, camouflage, removal, every detail he'd learned through trial and error. The soldiers were skeptical at first. Snakes wouldn't stop Americans. But Than showed them casualty statistics, patrol abort rates, reconnaissance effectiveness declines. By October, the method had spread to 2 divisions. By November, it was in use across the Central Highlands, never officially documented, never in the training manuals, just whispered knowledge that passed from unit to unit, soldier to soldier. Conservative estimates credit Than's snake trap method with disrupting or aborting 73 American reconnaissance patrols between June and December 1969. Those patrols would have gathered intelligence leading to hundreds of artillery strikes. The strikes would have killed hundreds of soldiers and destroyed countless tons of supplies. Lives saved, difficult to calculate precisely, but easily in the 200 to 300 range. The official documentation attributed the decline in reconnaissance effectiveness to improved NVA camouflage discipline and enhanced security awareness. Than's name appeared in no reports. His innovation received no formal recognition. The Army preferred it that way, admitting that a sergeant had solved a problem that stumped division planners was bad for morale. Nguyen Van Thanh survived the war. He was discharged in April 1973 after 7 years of service with the rank of lieutenant. No medals for the snake traps, no recognition beyond what his fellow soldiers gave him, which was all he wanted anyway. He went back to Thanh Hoa Province. The village school hired him as a teacher in June 1973. Same rice paddies he'd worked before the war. Same students, or their younger siblings. He married a woman named Lan from the next village over. They had 2 children. He never talked much about the Central Highlands. When asked, he'd say he did his duty and came home. Once a year, on June 17th, he'd receive visits from Cao, Min, and Dong. They'd talk for hours. Remember the helicopters and the patrols and the traps. Remember Locke and Duke and Kai. In 1984, an American researcher studying NVA tactics in the Central Highlands found references to an unexplained increase in reconnaissance patrol aborts during mid-1969. The pattern was specific to the area around Firebases Ripcord and Bastogne. The researcher interviewed Vietnamese veterans and found Thanh through Cao. Thanh agreed to 1 interview. He explained the method, provided dates and details, then asked that his name not be prominently featured in any publication. The researcher respected that request. The article, published in 1986 in a military history journal, attributed the innovation to unidentified NCOs in the 304th Division. Nguyen Van Thanh died in 2003 at age 56 from complications related to diabetes. His obituary in the Thanh Hoa provincial newspaper mentioned that he served in the People's Army and taught school for 30 years. It didn't mention snake traps, reconnaissance patrols, or lives saved. Lan knew he'd done something important in the Central Highlands, but never knew exactly what. The method itself lived longer than the man. Post-war analysis by military researchers validated the concept. Psychological deterrents targeting specific human fears were integrated into guerrilla warfare doctrine in multiple countries. The training manual credited field observations from the Vietnam War. Modern insurgent forces still teach variations of the technique, adapted to local conditions and available resources. The principle hasn't changed. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one, and sometimes soldiers in the jungle know more than planners at headquarters. That's how innovation actually happens in war, not through committees reviewing proposals and staff officers running calculations, through sergeants who can't watch their comrades die anymore, through rice farmers who learn to solve problems with whatever materials were available because nobody was going to give them anything better, through men who risked punishment to save lives and never asked for credit. The traps are still studied, the method is still analyzed, but the man who invented it went back to teaching children and never told anyone. Sometimes that's exactly right. The war took enough. It didn't need to take the rest of his life, too. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.